Hello and welcome to For Your Reference, brought to you by the Council on Library and Information Resources. I'm Robin.
I'm Paris.
I'm Joshua.
And this is not going to be an easy show today because we are going to be talking about some pretty dark stuff. In particular, we'll be discussing gun violence and school shootings. So two things before we start. First, we are shooting this in these United States in the year of our Lord 2023. And second, we are recording the show in advance. So given those two things, the likelihood that will air on a day that has included yet another mass shooting is quite high. Be aware that some content herein may not accurately reflect the gravity of the moment in which you are watching it. So, before we dive into the meat of this conversation, I'm guessing that we are all old enough that we didn't have to go through any active shooter drills in our childhood days. What drills do y'all remember having to do?
Yeah, no active shooter drills, but I am from a small town in Texas, so Tornado Alley, or it's called like Dixie Alley or something now. But I do remember tornado drills. So you go into the hallway, you like back up against the wall, you squat down, and you like tuck your head in to protect your spine and such from the crumbling bricks around you. But that's the only thing I have like a clear memory of. What about you, Joshua?
So no tornadoes in the Caribbean, thankfully. So all I remember were just fire drills, which were kind of great because it was a way of getting like a free period almost. Those tornado drills sound terrifying.
Yeah.
Protect your neck.
Yeah.
You have hurricanes and those are horrendous, but you get a couple days warning at least.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm from South Carolina, so I'm intimately familiar with hurricanes, also fire drills and tornado drills. And it's funny, we talked about this before. Since we landed on the idea of this discussion, I've been questioning my memory a bit about whether I actually remember doing those duck and cover drills, which suggested that you could, in fact, save yourself from a nuclear explosion. A nuclear bomb by hiding under a rickety school desk.
Right. Solid.
Yeah, no question against logic. Or if I just remember hearing a lot about them, right? I do remember vividly all the signs pointing to the nuclear fallout shelter. However, Cold War was fun times as a kid. Active shooter drills it came a long time after I was an adult, which I think might make them slightly less traumatizing for me than they do for kids we're putting these through, but I don't know if it makes them any less depressing. Anyway, that is the kind of fun stuff we'll be talking about today with our special guest in Reviewer 2. This is Reviewer 2, where we invite scholars on the show to ask them questions about their work, hopefully in a way that is productive and not soul-destroying. Our guest today is Dr. Brad Serber. He is an assistant teaching professor at Penn State University. Welcome to the show, Brad.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so to start us off, why don't you give us like a broad overview of your work and a little bit of a background on how you came to do it?
Sounds good. So the broad overview of my work is that I study the rhetoric of violence and the rhetoric of abnormality. So when I'm talking about the rhetoric of violence, I'm talking about how do we talk about violence, how do we deal with violence after it happens, and things like that. When I'm talking about the rhetoric of abnormality, I'm talking about who gets to determine what normal means and with what consequences. And those come together in the book project that I'm working on called Agora Phobia. And Agora Phobia is about the area of targeted violence. It's something that is a little bit different from just mass shootings, but it's not my term. I'll talk more about it, and we should scratch this too.
Well, actually, that was a question that I had. Is if you
I just thought that was the next question.
Yeah, you make a note that there's a shift from the term mass shootings to targeted violence. Talk about a little bit about why that was important as far as your work is concerned.
Yeah, so that's actually not my term. I wish it were. It's a term coming from some criminologists and forensic psychologists, and it's talking about things. Originally, it was talking about any number of incidents where someone planned an attack on anybody else that was unsuspecting. So it could include things like sexual violence, muggings, stalking, assassination attempts. It was a term from the 1990s, and since then it's come to refer to attacks mostly involving mass murder. And we talk about school shootings specifically, but targeted violence is a little bit more broad because it gets beyond just the weapon of guns. And that's a big feature of the book, is to talk about how guns are kind of the problem, and guns are also not the only problem. And so we hit a point in about 2015 where it's estimated that we have more guns than people in the United States. And a lot of the targeted violence attacks are carried out by guns, and specifically usually the AR-15. But there are other attacks that involve things like knives and cars and machetes and bombs, and I imagine in the future, sadly, drones. And so I'm looking at a broader pattern of people who are planning mass casualty attacks.
Yeah, so based on your research so far, where do you currently land on whether and how the media ought to be covering such stories?
Yeah, it's a complicated question. On the one hand, we need information, and the job of the media is to teach us about things that are happening in the world around us so that we can set the agenda and respond to those attacks that are happening. On the other hand, there is some concern that a lot of people who are planning these attacks are following the media coverage and are actually learning from the media coverage of previous attacks in order to plan the next attack and to make it more deadly.
Right. I remember you talking once about, I think it was specifically the Adam Lanza, and how he had done a lot of, they discovered that he had done actually a lot of research on other shooters. Can you talk a little bit about that? There was a moment you had, I think, in your research.
Yeah, Lanza was the shooter at Sandy Hook, and the police raided Nancy Lanza's house after that attack, and they found this giant multi-foot spreadsheet of research that he had conducted on previous attacks. And he spent several months prior to that attack alone in his bedroom with garbage bags over the windows, only communicating with his mother, and presumably doing a whole bunch of research in order to figure out what he wanted to do, how he wanted to do it, and how he wanted to make it as deadly as possible.
All right. That I knew this was going to be rough conversation today.
Yeah.
Let's shift a little bit away from specifics, and okay. So you also talk in your work about a thing called the rhetorical void. What exactly is that void, and what is it that's getting lost in there?
Yeah, the way that I describe the rhetorical void is it's a space where conversations disappear to. So whenever targeted violence happens and we have these attacks, what tends to happen is we have the same conversations over and over and over again. The primary one is usually about guns. There's usually some conversation about mental health. There's usually some conversation about location security. You know, how do we make our schools safer? How do we make the mall safer? How do we make our places of worship safer? And then law enforcement training, and how can law enforcement prevent this if it's the last possible step. I have a friend who is a law enforcement officer, and he refers to themselves as the period at the end of the sentence. And we have these micro conversations about each of those topics, and they go in places where people fight, usually in very partisan ways, and they have their own agendas, and they have these conversations. And what tends to happen is they get really intense, but they're also very short-lived. And the next event that happens that is newsworthy usually distracts us from it, and all four of those conversations tend to disappear into what I call the rhetorical void. That is, it's sort of the opposite of healthy public discourse. Rather than having any kind of conclusion about any one of those parts, what tends to happen is we talk about them briefly, and then we kind of forget about them. And then the next time another attack happens, we go back to the same conversations. And so there's this joke in The Onion that says something like, you know, there's no way to prevent this, says the only nation where this ever happens. And we talk about guns, and this headline keeps popping up on The Onion. They've done it like probably a dozen times over the last 10 years. And there is something to be said about that being about guns, but it's not just about the guns. There's other issues at play here. And so what we see is after one attack, there'll be something, and after Columbine, Dave Cullen talks about it in his book, it was a tornado or a series of tornadoes. And suddenly the media attention shifted from Columbine to a bunch of tornadoes. And so it can be anything that comes up. And all of these conditions are what a lot of people in academia will call necessary but insufficient conditions. What that means is they're all parts of a puzzle, and each one of them could help solve the problem. But even if we could solve all of them simultaneously, it might not solve the problem of targeted violence completely.
Right. So, and jump in if I don't want to dominate the conversation, Joshua and Paris, but I think we can tie that back to you. Agora Phobia is what you said you were going to title the book, and I think there are probably some audience members who are thinking you're mispronouncing agoraphobia. And so for all the people out there who are not deep nerds in the area of rhetoric, talk a little bit about that title and why.
Yeah,
I think
absolutely.
it ties back into what you were just saying.
Sure. Yeah. The Agora in ancient Greece was the place where political discussions happened. And it was a place specifically for usually white men in power. And they would have these intense political discussions. And sometimes it was healthy debate and sometimes it wasn't healthy debate. I'm arguing in the book that the conversations that we're having around targeted violence are not healthy debate. And a lot of that is tied into the contemporary psychological definition of agoraphobia, which is a fear of public places. I think a lot of people get very scared when targeted violence happens. It's something that is very uncomfortable. The idea that human beings can be hunted is really terrifying. And I know a lot of people who are saying, I'm thinking about homeschooling my kids. I'm afraid to go to the mall. I'm afraid to go to the gym. I'm afraid to go anywhere. And they have these conversations, and the conversation is often grounded in it's in this mentality of, we need to stop this once and for all. These things never used to happen. There's got to be a way to get back to some mythical past where we didn't have to worry about this kind of stuff. And if we just solved guns, if we just solved mental illness, if we just solved location security or law enforcement training, we'd be able to fix this once and for all. And that was the mentality that I went into the book thinking about. And that was what I wanted this book to be. And the evidence kept bringing me in a different direction, kept pointing me to all of the various factors that make it seem like these events, unfortunately, are going to keep happening.
Right. So if talking about prevention is and that's where we always land, right? And of course, I'm thinking about the United States because, again, the only country where this continues to happen. If we're not going to talk about prevention, what conversation do we need to have, or do we just need to have? I think what you're saying is we need to have multiple conversations, mm-hmm. And can you bring that together at all, at least in your head?
Yeah, absolutely. The alternative that I'm going to be arguing for in the book is a rhetoric instead of preparation rather than prevention. And that's not to say that we shouldn't be trying to prevent these events from happening. That's sort of the gold standard of what we want to strive toward, and we can approximate it. I think we can get pretty close to it if we pull on all of those pieces that are necessary but insufficient conditions. I think we can approximate something that looks like total prevention, but I think the conversation around prevention is actually setting us up for failure, because what I often see is people saying we need to be the last mass shooting. We can't have any more of these, not one more. And what happens, I think, when we have that kind of conversation about total prevention or a failure is we're actually setting ourselves up for failure. That is, if these events are going to continue to happen and we say anything short of prevention is a failure, then it re-traumatizes people every time that another attack happens. And so what I'm going to be arguing for instead is a rhetoric of preparation. And what the other thing that you tend to see when these attacks happen is people in their communities being interviewed by journalists and saying, I never thought this could have happened here. When Columbine was an affluent white suburb of Denver, and people never thought that it could happen there, and it's happened there. It's happened in a rural schoolhouse in Nickel Mines, Pennsylvania. It's happened in all kinds of urban, rural, suburban, college town locations, and a lot of people never thought that it could happen there, and so they don't necessarily prepare for it in the way that they probably should be preparing for it. And so the argument that I want to make is we need to act as if this could happen in our community, hope that it doesn't. And I don't say that in the casual thoughts and prayers discourse that tends to get thrown around here, but actually really take solid efforts to try to prevent targeted violence from happening, or at least to prepare for it in the event that it does, so that if it happens, we don't see it as a total failure, and we can try to minimize the harm and the injuries and the deaths that result from it, rather than saying anything short of prevention is total failure and we're just going to bury our heads in the sand and hope that it doesn't happen to us and duck and cover.
Right. So that part of the conversation then, does that tie into stasis theory? You mentioned using that as a framework. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is and how that frames things for us?
Yeah, so stasis theory is coming from around the same time as the Agora. We're talking about an ancient Greek law court system is actually where this originated. And it was a way of trying to figure out what kinds of arguments we were having when someone was accused of a crime. So traditionally, there were 4 stases, and they were each different kinds of arguments. So there was the stasis of fact or conjecture, which is sort of like, what happened here? Do we have a shared reality of the events that happened? We have definition questions, that is, what do we call this thing? Is it murder? Is it manslaughter? Is it something else? Then we have questions of value, of how good or how bad something is. And oftentimes when we're talking about law, we're talking about how bad someone's crime is. And then we have the stasis of policy, where we try to figure out, okay, what's the appropriate punishment, or in contemporary terms, what's the appropriate course of action after something happens. And so those are the 4 original stases. There have been some contemporary rhetoricians who've added a 5th one, the stasis of causes and consequences, sort of, what caused this and what kinds of effects does it have? And I'm drawing primarily off of the stases of causes and consequences in policy here. So I'm borrowing from who was then a lawyer, Kate Klonick, has a really good article that she wrote in Popular Press, and it was talking about why and what now. And she was saying that a lot of times we have these conversations around targeted violence, and we're obsessively trying to figure out why it is that people do this. And we have some evidence for why people might engage in targeted violence. Oftentimes they'll leave manifestos, they'll leave other clues, they'll leak information to other people and say, I'm thinking about planning this kind of attack. And they won't say it in that kind of language, they'll kind of subtly drop hints about it. And we can sort of take those people at their words. If they have manifestos they've written, we can identify things in their manifestos. The shooter in Isla Vista, for instance, was very misogynistic. We've had several who were anti-Semitic or xenophobic or racist. We've had several who seem to be just very mentally ill. And we kind of obsessively focus on, if we can just figure out why these are happening, then we can prevent them from happening again. And rather than getting caught up in the why, I'm actually more focused on the what now. And the argument that I'm making toward the end of the book, the last chapter, is called a what now without a why. That is, there are some situations where we don't necessarily know why this is happening. The Las Vegas shooter, for instance, really, it seems, tried to cover his tracks. And this was actually the deadliest mass shooting in modern US history. Seems like he didn't really want people to know why he ended up doing this. And he didn't really fit a type. There isn't really a type, but there wasn't really any kind of motivating factor that law enforcement and criminologists were able to identify there. And even for the ones that do leave manifestos, we sometimes have to take them at their word, but there might be, reasons not to do that if they are severely mentally ill, or if there's, other reasons to question their ideology or other things that might be factoring into their motivations. I'm not so interested in the question of why these things keep happening, because I don't think that's going to get an answer to how to prevent it from happening in the future. And so the question that I'm trying to lead people toward is, okay, so what do we do now if even knowing the answer to why doesn't necessarily give us the clue for how to stop these once and for all? And I think that's going to lead to healthier public discourse in the Agora.
So out of all of this conversation, which has been incredibly difficult, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you.
One of the things that I liked about what you just said is that you're talking about a we. It's obvious that this is going to be kind of a concerted effort between all parts of society. That the media has a responsibility, academia has a responsibility to have or change the conversation simply because of the power that it has. But we, as in we, the regular folks, how do we start participating in that? How do we start informing ourselves? And kind of on a side note, not so side note of this, but probably something that all of us are going to need after this, including our audiences. How do you deal with being in such dark corners of, contemporary times for your research and still stay sane, functional, empathetic, compassionate?
Yeah, I think I'll actually work backwards from your last question. So my wife makes fun of me because oftentimes I will do this kind of research for several hours over the course of my day, and then I drive her nuts because I'll go home and watch reruns of Friends or The Simpsons or some kind of sitcom from the 90s as a way of calming myself down. It has a clear script. I know where the jokes are. I know when I'm going to laugh, and it's just, for some reason, it helps calm me down. I also started writing about this before my wife and I were married and before we had our 2 kids, and I got into writing about this specifically because it frightened me. I actually was watching the movie version of We Need to Talk About Kevin, which I believe came out in 2012. And I was watching it with my sister, who is a psychologist, and we were both really frightened by targeted violence in general. And I remember talking to my master's thesis advisor and saying, I think I'm going to write my dissertation about school shootings. And he looked at me and said, "Oh God, please don't do that." And I didn't ask him further about that, and I wish I had. But I think part of it was that he was saying at the time he was hoping that wasn't going to become a stable genre of things that we would be able to identify. But 2, I think he was worried about exactly what you're talking about, that sort of emotional energy and how do you handle this? And for me, a lot of it is about focusing on the things that I can and can't control. I will say that I have been in therapy for the last few years, and my therapist is wonderful and has been really helpful with this. I've talked to several people who find themselves in really frightening situations where they're like, I really just can't stop thinking about this, and I'm constantly worried about my child, and I don't think it's healthy. And I went through a 6-month phase a couple of years ago, and this project started as a dissertation where I mapped out my exits to every room that I walked into, and I realized, that probably wasn't healthy, even though it might have in some ways been saving my life. Had something happened, I would know at least where to go and get out. But I also realized the toll that it was taking on my mental health, and that's part of why I started therapy. And so I think a lot of what I cope with is focusing on the things that I can and can't control. I focus a lot on my wife and my children. I focus a lot on the fact that some of this is as uncontrollable as a tornado or a hurricane or some of the things you all mentioned in your introduction. And the main thing that keeps me focused and grounded is focusing on the statistics of it. And the statistics of it are really the case that it's not as common as we think it is. And it's not to take away from how terrible it is when it happens. It's one of the worst imaginable things that we can think of, but it happens very infrequently. There was a book that I read in preparation for this project that talked about school shootings in general. And it talked about how children are more likely to die biking to and from school than they are to die at school. And that's not just talking about mass shootings in schools, that's talking about at school in general. And so we have this fear of my kid isn't going to make it home from the school bus. And that's a rational fear, given that it's terrifying if it were to happen. But it's also sort of an irrational fear, just given that it doesn't happen all that often. And one of the things that I struggle with the most in doing this kind of research is talking to people who are victims of this, who have lost children, who have lost relatives, who have lost friends, family members, colleagues, coworkers. And I don't want to re-traumatize them by doing this work, but at the same time, I don't want their trauma to make everybody else so scared that we all become agoraphobic.
Yeah. Brad, thank you so much for sharing and being vulnerable and talking about therapy and how it affected you, and also your coping mechanisms for this, because I think all of us will need some after this. So since our time with you is almost over, I think it's fitting to ask if you have any advice for those who might want to learn more about targeted violence or mass shootings, and where you would suggest they start.
Yeah, the place where I would suggest to start is the original targeted violence article. It's Fine, Voskuhl, and Holden from 1995, and it's a criminology piece. That was the original piece that talks about the definition of targeted violence. From there, there's actually a very good book by journalist Mark Fullman, who works for Mother Jones. He has a book called Trigger Points, where he gives the origin story of targeted violence and the people behind it, and the conversations that have evolved over the last 25, 30 years around targeted violence. I have several colleagues who are doing excellent work in this field as well. So my dissertation advisor, Rosa Eberly, is fantastic. Her fellow advisee, Craig Rood, has a book called After Gun Violence. It's also very good. Our friend Seamus McGraw, who's a journalist, has another book called I'm blanking on the name of it. I think it's From a Taller Tower. But there are several people who are doing this work in academia. There are also several journalists who are doing this work. And a lot of my work is very journalistic based. And in the book, I'm going to challenge some of the practices of journalism, but at the same time, there's a lot of respect for journalists. And I think the main advice that I would have for people who want to do this kind of research is, one, know yourself really well and what triggers you. And I use that phrase not lightly, given the gun rhetoric, but know what your triggers are, know why you're interested in studying this in the first place. Again, for me, it came from a place of being very afraid of this. Even before I was married and had kids, I was very afraid about my own life and what my family and my friends would think if this happened to me. And really researching the details and the statistics about it were helpful for me to calm myself down. And so originally it was a very anxiety producing kind of research. Over time, it's gotten to the point where I still have moments where it's hard for me, but it actually helps calm my anxiety to learn about what's happened and how often it happens and how often it doesn't happen. I think that's the most important thing. That said, I will say I also keep what I call a crying log. So it started as the dissertation crying log. Now it's the book crying log of times that I have read something and it's made me cry. And there have been a lot of them. There's been a couple dozen times where I've cried writing this project. And we talk in media research about desensitization to violence and how if you're exposed to violence all the time, suddenly it's like not a big deal. And, it starts to not faze you and you kind of question whether that's a good thing. And for me, I was very worried that I was becoming desensitized to this. And the fact that I still cry about it pretty often is a good indicator that it's still impactful and important. And that's a lot of why I continue to do this research.
Well, thank you so much for me for doing this work. As if the dissertation process isn't enough to make you cry alone, the content can't make it much better. And I think, sadly, that's all the time we have for you today. But thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
And now, to help us think better about how we do more research on this topic, we are heading over to Joshua and Paris with Check This Out.
All right, welcome back, everyone. I'm Paris, and this is my co-host, Joshua.
Hi, all.
And we're going to have a conversation today covering the media literacy perspective of the Reviewer 2 segment. This time, we're going to be discussing the heavy and all too familiar topic of communication and violence, or violence as a type of communication. We're going to give you some vocabulary, a few resources, and some key questions to help you on your journey to understanding this topic in relation to the world around you. And if you go back to the Reviewer 2 segment, Brad gave you some advice at the end, so feel free to review that first.
So as a non-media literacy person on this, I'm coming at it from the digital scholarship perspective, which in this particular case, there's a ton of overlap for me. Since digital literacy is associated with the ability to use computers, social media, the internet, and media literacy is this ability to be critical about the narratives that are being created through mass media, the internet, so on. All of these things sort of coincide and overlap. And when looking at digital scholarship projects, either creating them or looking at them critically, you have to ask yourself, what data is being gathered, what modes are being used to present it. So things like commercials promoting a candidate's stance on a trending topic will have both the message that you're listening to, but also data visualizations like graphs, interactive maps. But we'll we'll talk a little bit more into the weeds.
Yeah. Let's not rush that. Let's start from the beginning, though. So let's try to gain some perspective on our topic of communication and violence. And this process begins with what we've talked about before, with is what you know and search terms or a vocabulary. So Joshua, I don't know if you remember, but in an episode with our reviewer 2 guest, Sam Martin, you mentioned the Dunning-Kruger effect. Can you briefly remind us what that theory has to do with what we already know?
Sure. So this is very much something that the internet and social media picked up and ran with. It is a real theory trying to understand human behavior, but just to kind of put us in this state of mind, the Dunning-Kruger effect is a way of explaining why people that aren't particularly skilled in an area, right, they don't have the expertise in an area, feel that they are competent, or that the thing that they're unskilled at is easier than it actually is, right? So if you try to translate that to the conversation that we're having, someone who's not incredibly familiar with gun violence, communication studies, any kind of media literacy would think, because of their experiences, these things are really simple. You just have to look at them and you know, right? And as we saw from the conversation in reviewer 2, we all have experiences with these. We all have experience with gun violence, whether it be through firsthand experience, experienced by consuming media, or being part of a community. All of that shapes the way that we perceive how this topic gets covered and how we interpret it.
Yeah.
But that does not mean that our experience by itself gives us enough information to understand it completely.
Yeah, thank you for explaining. So as we're moving through the media literacy process, with your previous knowledge about this subject, you can build a vocabulary to search. So for example, when I'm doing library instruction, I do an activity to kind of help students build a vocabulary. I provide an image related to an assignment from like Associated Press images, or for example here, Wikipedia. And I pull along the metadata or the image record or description with it. I then have the students submit words that might be used to search for the related sources, which basically builds this word cloud. And that's how we build our vocabulary. And we can discuss whatever terms are available using the metadata, whatever preconceived notions the students have. And we can all have a conversation about it in a non-judgment zone, because we are doing this anonymously. However, in this case, we're actually going to use the resources that we use to prepare for this segment, as well as our own experiences to frame our search. So what you see here is a list of terms. You'll notice that some of them are from our conversation earlier. Some are from significant tragic events, others policies, people, and so on. These terms may vary results, and you might get news articles, you might get interviews or videos, but keep in mind that resources aren't limited to text. So for example, gun violence prevention and ad campaigns and NRA sponsored advertisements are still resources that you can use to aid in your search and help you build context from different perspectives, you know?
Yeah, and that I'm glad you brought up this multimodal aspect, right? So if you're thinking media, we might think regular articles, text, yes. But in reality, most of what we're looking at is multimodal sharing of information. So the campaigns and ads that you see on daytime TV, those are multimodal, right? You're getting exposed to multiple modes of information sharing. So similar to the multimodal messaging active shooter training messages that Serber and Everly wrote about in their essay, information is coming at us in a bunch of different ways at the same time, complementing each other. The way that we interpret it has a role, but there's also an agenda, kind of narrative as to what is being transmitted through these different things. And so focusing on just the text might mean that you are not seeing the entire message of what's actually being conveyed. This happens often with people watching horror films. Watch a horror film without the soundtrack, it does not sound that scary. Once you add those two things together, right? Same concept for looking at those TV ads. So when those modes come together for an audience, what they're doing is they're interpreting what they are seeing with the experience that they have, right? Their own background. The way that we interpret those ads, which are sponsored to build a narrative, right? And we talked about that in the first Check This Out. Always ask, why is this person producing this? Why is this person generating this? For who is it for? Our understanding of that narrative starts with us understanding the basics of a subject, the basic of a concept. And it's a lot of moving parts, but I just want to backtrack real quick to the idea of multimodal, because it sounds like a big fancy word for something that is simple, and this is not a Dunning-Kruger effect. It is just a useful way of saying that what you're looking at is not just one form of information, one packaging of that information, right? So like I said before, a news article that only has text would say that's a unimodal form of communication. It's just textual, right? That is rarely the case anymore, right? You can't look at media and simply see one set of information. Some people would argue layout itself is another form of expressing information and communicating things that complement the text. But for basic idea of it, once you add images to text, audio, layouts, graphs, anything like that, you are talking about multimodal content, right? And so this is an example of multimodal content where there are different elements that are meant to inform the reader, and it's trying to reach an audience from different points of view, different perspectives at the same time, right? Note that in the descriptions, you have the sponsors or contributors, so you know who is making this, you know who is paying for this to be made. Mm-hmm. And you also have this idea of the visual map indicating hotspots. So right as you jump in, this is what you're presented in. You are looking at a trend, right? That's what those circles are meant to convey. So even though you're thinking, oh, this is just a map geography where things happen, this is actually expressing relationships between those different places and relationships between events.
Yeah. As a visual learner, I really appreciate data visualizations, especially when they're interactive. They're just fun to deal with. And also it can kind of help you learn to be a little bit more curious and help you build your own questions. It's just a unique way to kind of share and digest important information. So I'm glad you talked about the multimodal aspect of data visualization, especially since they both came up in our searches when we were researching this topic. Now, getting back on track, we want to record the sources that you agree and you disagree with throughout this process. So use your metadata and your ever expanding search terms, like your author affiliation, sponsors, events, and organizations attached to the subject to collect different perspective. Now, there's a lot that goes into choosing your sources, and I'd like to suggest starting with an information professional or reputable sources first. So I'm referring to a full, what's happening?
I was just saying reputable information.
Oh, sorry. Sorry. Yes, we are reputable to an extent. Like, you can't trust us all the time as well. But anyways, some of these might be, say, your libraries, your museums, and even local organizations that support a cause. So some of the questions you might ask yourself as you vet this resource and try to draw your own conclusions, you might ask, how credible is this source that we're looking at? You know, who might be harmed by these messages? Who might benefit from these messages? And many of these other questions that are listed here. So putting everything that we've discussed together, we've got a nice list of search terms. We've identified starting points for locating different perspectives and some advice for evaluating sources in their context. These are the first steps in thinking critically about mass shootings, communication, and violence, you know?
Yeah, I just want to add, as we said before, explore this topic at your own pace, know why you're interested in this, know why it's important to you, and know why you're invested in it. Sources might lead you to other related Other like related events, correlating data. So the Pew Research Center, which gets cited a lot. You might also come across organizations that you feel you would not agree with, like the NRA, but that also have information, data, and other perspectives which you need to have for an informed opinion. Also look for local or discipline-specific data, which is really useful for understanding the context in which you're in, right? It's one thing to understand the number of violent events going on in New York. If you're in Wyoming, that's really useful to know about New York, but maybe not so useful to know about where you are and where your community is. And some of those discipline specifics are the American Libraries and Association LibGuides. The American Public Health Association also has great data. And just like everyone else, you need to assess their influence of resources, right? It's going to take some time, but as you practice, you'll get better at understanding the data that they're putting out there.
Yeah.
But to save you time, we've provided some sources, including the ones that we use for this show. So you get to cheat on your homework. There are databases, government websites, and other references that can help you build an informed opinion.
Yeah. So I hope that y'all get to shuffle through those in your own time. But that's enough for this time around. It's been a heavy moment. So let's take a break from accessing and collecting sources on communication and violence, and join us next time when we'll discuss the analysis of sources and what activism might look like. So thanks for hanging around. We hope you learned something. If you'd like to join us in the media literacy process, let us know what sources caught your attention, or the voices that altered your perspective. Follow us on IG at FIRPod. Till next time, y'all.
All right. Thank y'all for that great information. I think that's another wrap for us. Do either of y'all have anything else you want to share before I go curl up with my cat?
Stay safe.
Yeah, be safe.
Be safe, be kind to each other.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to do some self-care. Actually, this past weekend, this topic came up with a colleague. We were actually thinking about going to a show, but we were actually very nervous because it was for a minority community. We thought about targeted violence, and we were like, so it's real out here.
Yeah, it is indeed. But thank y'all for watching out there, and we will see you next time.